entitled The State of Airline Safety, Federal Oversight of Commercial Aviation. Welcome to each of the witnesses. On March 10th, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 departed Addis Ababa Airport with 157 souls on board. Among them were parents and children, reverends and international aid workers, and college students with their entire lives ahead of them. But at 8:44 a.m., 6 minutes after takeoff, what should have been a routine 2-hour flight turned into a tragedy. Flight 302 crashed, killing all 157 people. Although devastating on its own, the tragedy of Flight 302 was compounded by the fact that something like this had happened less than 6 months earlier. Lion Air Flight 610 had been in the air just 12 minutes before plunging into the Java Sea at 6:32 a.m. on October 29, 2018, killing all 189 people on board. The 346 men, women, and children lost in these tragic crashes came from 35 different countries, ranged in age from the elderly to the unborn, and had professions as diverse as their backgrounds. But they did have one thing in common. They were all traveling on a brand new plane, a Boeing 737 MAX. It is truly unfortunate that today's hearing is necessary, and I wish we didn't have to be here today. But our first priority in aviation must always be the safety of the flying public. The fact of the matter is that these crashes and subsequent reports on how the 737 MAX was approved have badly shaken consumer confidence. In aviation, as in other industries where a small mistake can have catastrophic consequences, trust is the currency of the realm. Trust of the flying public in the safety of the aircraft they step onto. Trust of our international partners in the diligence and thoroughness of our regulatory bodies. And increasingly, trust of our regulatory bodies in the quality and truthfulness of the data and certifications provided and performed by industry. Not only have the recent crashes shaken the confidence of the public, but the questions that have been raised in the aftermath about FAA's oversight of aircraft manufacturers, the certification process for planes, and the close relationship between industry and regulator threaten to erode trust in the entire system. It is incumbent on us, as legislators, as regulators, and as industry leaders, to work to ensure that that does not occur. Today's hearing takes the first step down that road by seeking to answer some fundamental questions. First, we need to understand exactly what happened, both in these specific crashes and with the certification process for the MAX aircraft, so that we can take action to keep something like these tragic crashes from occurring again. Second, we need to look at the aviation safety space more broadly and identify where we can and should make improvements. We need to answer, or at least begin to answer, questions like, is the FAA taking the right approach to the oversight and certification of aircraft manufacturing, operations, and repair, particularly with regard to designated authority? Also answering, how safe is commercial aviation, both in the United States and internationally? And how can we increase the level of safety even further? And how can we restore the confidence and trust of the flying public, both in the United States and internationally? As our witnesses today will highlight in their testimony, commercial aviation in the United States today is as safe as it ever has been. Worldwide, and particularly in the United States, the likelihood of being in a fatal commercial plane crash is infinitesimally low. And this is a record that we can and should be proud of. But this record is also exactly what makes the recent crashes and reports of lenient oversight by the FAA so frustrating. As a nation, we have been on such a promising upward trend in safety that although these crashes occurred in foreign countries, the questions that have been raised about the integrity of our regulatory processes strikes right to the heart of aviation safety here at home. We need to do better, and I firmly believe that we can. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member of the Aviation and Space Subcommittee, Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Chairman Cruz, for holding this timely and important hearing. I look forward to building a strong relationship and working closely with you on this and other issues in our subcommittee's jurisdiction. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. The United States airspace and U.S. aviation are the safest in the world. The United States is the leader in aviation and aviation safety thanks to the dedication of thousands of skilled individuals on the manufacturing floor, on the ground at airports, in control towers, and in the air. Our safety also relies on the advocacy of concerned citizens, like the families of Continental Flight 3407, who tirelessly advocate for safer skies. Thank you for being here today and for your work on this important issue. The aviation industry is a major economic driver. Safe, affordable, and convenient air travel is critical to the well-being of industry, job creation, and economic growth. The system is successful because it is safe, and people know and trust that it is safe. Tragedies like the Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air crashes are unimaginable in the U.S. and must remain so. But they and other recent incidents raise important questions about maintaining a safe national airspace system and U.S. leadership in aviation and safety. It's imperative that we quickly fix any problems within FAA's oversight, evaluation, and approval processes to ensure safety in American skies, restore trust, and maintain U.S. global leadership in aviation and aviation safety. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Senator Cruz, and I want to thank Senator Cruz and Senator Sinema for holding this subcommittee hearing on the timely subject of aviation safety. As both the chair and ranking member mentioned in their remarks, the remarkable safety record of U.S. passenger airline travel is a testament to decades of hard work and painful lessons learned by a great many stakeholders. Today's hearing represents the beginning of this year's work in this area. The committee intends to hold a second hearing on aviation safety to hear from non-government witnesses, including Boeing. We understand that the investigations into the Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air crashes are ongoing and may limit certain details from being discussed in this forum. However, our witnesses can cover a lot of information today, including addressing the FAA's response to these tragedies, the certification process, pilot training, and broader concerns about the increasing complexity and automation of aircraft systems. The FAA has long been considered the gold standard internationally when it comes to safety. It is vital that we work with our partners throughout the world to promote safe air transportation. The committee will continue to discuss robust oversight to ensure the safety of our aviation system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing today to discuss the paramount issue of aviation safety here in the United States and around the world. I thank the witnesses for being here and their insights today, and I too want to recognize the families of the Colgan Air Flight 3407 who are here today, because it is their continued persistence about getting aviation right that is so admirable. Thank them, and thank you all for being here. The incidents that led us here today of the crash of Lion Air 610 last October and the Ethiopian Flight 302 are horrible human tragedies. I want to extend my deepest sympathies to the families and everyone impacted by this horrific incident. These two accidents cost 346 lives, leaving behind countless individuals and loved ones who I know want to make sure this is never repeated. The human toll is why we work every day to ensure that every possible step is taken to determine the causes that contributed to these incidents. And through the crash investigations, other federal investigations, and ongoing congressional oversight, I believe we all share the same goal, to make sure these accidents are never repeated. It is critical that all those involved look at the causes of the accident and work so that everyone has the full picture of what happened. Investigators in Indonesia and in Ethiopia, with the help from NTSB and FAA and other international partners, are working through the evidence to determine the causes of these accidents. And even though, as my colleagues have mentioned, global commercial aviation has experienced unprecedented periods of safety over the last decade, these two accidents are horrific reminders that we must remain vigilant in our oversight and focus on safety. So I look forward to hearing the information from the witnesses that is available for us today. And I also commend yesterday's Secretary Chow's indication that she will seek a previously authorized authority by the last 2018 FAA bill, which authorizes the establishment of a special committee of aviation experts to review the recommendations on the Federal Aviation Administration procedure process. So I look forward to their analysis as I do the analysis of all the investigations that are ongoing. Safety remains paramount, and I look forward to working with all my colleagues on this very serious issue.
Thank you. I'll now introduce each of the witnesses. The first witness is Mr. Daniel K. Elwell, who is currently the Acting Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. Before becoming Acting Administrator, Mr. Elwell served as the Deputy Administrator of the FAA from June 2017 to January 2018, and as a Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, prior to that. Mr. Elwell began his career in aviation in the United States Air Force, where he received his Bachelor of Science degree in International Affairs from the U.S. Air Force Academy. He achieved the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and retired from military service as a command pilot. After retiring from the military, Mr. Elwell was a commercial pilot for 16 years with American Airlines, flying DC-10, MD-80, and Boeing 757-767 aircraft. And he then served at the FAA as Assistant Administrator for Policy Planning and Environment from 2006 to 2008. From 2008 to 2013, Mr. Elwell served as Vice President of the Aerospace Industries Association, and from 2013 to 2015 as Senior Vice President for Safety, Security, and Operations at Airlines for America. Our second witness is the Honorable Robert Sumwalt. Following his nomination by President Trump and confirmation by the Senate, Robert L. Sumwalt was sworn in as Chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board on August 10, 2017. Prior to joining the NTSB, Chairman Sumwalt was a pilot for more than 30 years, during which time he flew for commercial carriers that included Piedmont Airlines and U.S. Airways, and accumulated over 14,000 flight hours. He began his tenure at the NTSB in August 2006, when he was appointed to the board by President George W. Bush and designated as Vice Chairman. In 2011, he was reappointed for an additional 5-year term as a board member by President Obama. Chairman Sumwalt earned his undergraduate degree from the University of South Carolina and a Master's of Aeronautical Science with distinction from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He has been awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree from the University of South Carolina and an honorary doctorate from Embry-Riddle. Our third witness is the Honorable Calvin Scovel. Mr. Scovel was sworn in as Inspector General of the Department of Transportation on October 26, 2006. Prior to joining the DOT, he served 29 years of active duty service in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he retired as a Brigadier General. During his military career, he served as a senior judge on the U.S. Navy Marine Corps Court of Appeals and as an assistant judge, advocate general of the Navy for Military Justice, and as a senior advisor for the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade. His tenure as the DOT Inspector General has spanned the administrations of 3 presidents and 4 secretaries of transportation, during which time he has overseen audits and investigations dealing with all aspects of the nation's transportation system. Mr. Scovel received a law degree from Duke University, a bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a master's degree from the Naval War College, and he is a recipient of the Secretary of Transportation's Gold Medal for Outstanding Achievement. Administrator Elwell will begin with your testimony.
Chairman Cruz, Chairman Wicker, Ranking Ranking Member Sinema, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. On behalf of the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration, I extend our deepest sympathy to the families of the passengers and the crews of Ethiopian Airlines 302 and Lion Air 610. Safety is at the core of the FAA's mission. It is our first priority. We have worked tirelessly to take a more proactive, data-driven approach to oversight that instills a safety above all else culture at the FAA and the aviation community we regulate. This approach has made the U.S. aviation system the safest in the world. Since 1997, the risk of a fatal commercial aviation accident in the United States has been cut by 94%. And in the past 10 years, we've experienced one commercial airline passenger fatality in the United States in over 90 million flights. That's a remarkable record, but we know we must never stop pursuing improvement. We must never become complacent because one fatality is one too many. I speak to you today as both a former military and airline pilot, and as a public servant who has dedicated his life to the pursuit of aviation safety. I am proud to lead the dedicated professionals of the FAA who share the same passion and sense of mission to make America's aviation system the safest. Because we know our fact-based, data-driven approach works, we have applied this guiding principle in our response to the recent Boeing 737 MAX accidents. I would like to provide you with an overview of the FAA's certification and oversight processes, as well as our current actions with respect to the 737 MAX and the next steps the FAA will take to foster safety enhancements here and abroad. Safety is not just a set of programs that can be established or implemented. It is a way of living and working, and it requires the open and transparent exchange of information. It takes collaboration, communication, and common safety objectives to allow the FAA and the aviation community to jointly identify system hazards and to implement safety solutions. Decades of experience have proven that this approach yields knowledge that we would not otherwise obtain. FAA aircraft certification has always relied on the exchange of information and technical data with industry. Some version of our certification process has been in place for over 60 years. This does not mean that the process remains static. To keep pace with technology and advances in safety, the general regulations have been modified more than 90 times. The rules applicable to large transport aircraft like the 737 MAX have been amended more than 130 times. The FAA focuses its efforts on those areas that present the highest risk within the system. Our certification processes are extensive, well-established, and have consistently produced safe aircraft designs for decades. Boeing first applied for an amended certificate for the 737 MAX in January 2012. From initial application to final certification, it took about 5 years. The FAA was fully involved in the process, including participation in 133 of the 297 flight tests, some of which encompassed tests of the aircraft's MCAS system, which has been the subject of recent attention. In the immediate aftermath of the Lion Air accident, the FAA issued an emergency airworthiness directive that requires operators of the 737 MAX to revise their flight manuals to reinforce to flight crews how to recognize and respond to uncommanded stabilizer trim movement. The FAA continues to seek and evaluate any additional data that might help us understand the underlying factors that led to the recent 737 MAX accidents. We will take immediate and appropriate action based on the facts. U.S. and international operators of the 737 MAX are relying on the FAA to get it right. I want to assure you and everyone else that the FAA will go wherever the facts lead us in our pursuit of safety. The 737 MAX will return to service for U.S. carriers only when the FAA's analysis of the facts and technical data indicate that it is appropriate to do so. In our quest for continuous safety improvement, the FAA welcomes external review of our systems, processes, and recommendations. As recent events have reminded us, aviation safety has no borders or boundaries. The FAA is resolute in its commitment to maintaining the U.S. air transportation system as the gold standard of the world. Concludes my statement. I'm ready to answer any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sumwalt.
Thank you, Chairman Wicker, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, Ranking Member Sinema, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for allowing the NTSB to testify today about this very important topic. As you are well aware, in the past 5 months, there have been 2 crashes involving the Boeing 737 MAX, and tragically, these 2 accidents have claimed 346 lives. My testimony this afternoon will focus on the NTSB's involvement with each of these crash investigations. Now, unlike the NTSB's involvement in domestic aviation accidents, where we have the statutory responsibility to investigate each and every accident that occurs in this country, our involvement with international investigations is vastly different. The NTSB role in accidents outside the U.S. is governed by Annex 13 to the Convention on International Civil Aviation, to which 192 countries, including the U.S., are signatories. Annex 13 states that a safety investigation is to be led by the country in which the accident occurs, known as the state of occurrence. Thus, the National Transportation Safety Committee of Indonesia is leading the investigation into last year's Lion Air crash, and likewise, the Ethiopia Accident Investigation Bureau is leading the investigation into this month's Ethiopian Airlines crash. When the accident involves a U.S.-operated or U.S.-registered aircraft or U.S.-designed or manufactured aircraft, as these aircraft were, the NTSB appoints an accredited representative. This is a highly skilled NTSB investigator whose purpose is to coordinate the input of all U.S. interests, including the NTSB, the FAA, and companies such as manufacturers and others that can provide technical assistance. It's important to note that the state of occurrence leads the investigation and controls the release of information from that investigation, not the NTSB. Although the state of occurrence is responsible for leading the investigation, NTSB participation in foreign accident investigations enables safety deficiencies to be promptly addressed by the FAA, the manufacturer, or the operator, as well as through NTSB safety recommendations when necessary. Following last year's Lion Air crash, we immediately dispatched investigators to Indonesia to participate in the Indonesian government's investigation. An NTSB investigator was stationed on board one of the search vessels to help identify recovered aircraft components. Once the cockpit voice recorder was recovered in January, we recalled 4 investigators who were furloughed during the partial government shutdown. Their role was to assist with the recorder download and analysis. We responded immediately to the Ethiopian Airlines crash by sending a team of investigators to Ethiopia. And once the recorders were sent to our aviation counterparts in France, the BEA, we dispatched investigators to France to assist with the recorder download and readout. Because the U.S. is a state of design and certification of the Boeing 737, we are also examining the U.S. design certification process as part of our participation in these foreign-led investigations. As always, if we uncover safety deficiencies, we are poised to quickly issue safety recommendations. Now, here at home, the scheduled passenger airlines have had displayed a remarkable safety record over the past decade. But as we know too well at the NTSB, complacency is an unforgiving enemy. My written testimony outlines other areas of NTSB aviation-related concerns, which I have submitted for the record, and I'll be delighted to answer questions about those issues as well as the issue at hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Scovel.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Sinema, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the Federal Aviation Administration's oversight of commercial aviation. As you know, FAA is charged with safely overseeing the busiest and most complex aviation system in the world. Yet recent accidents highlight important concerns about FAA's safety oversight. Most notable are the two devastating crashes of Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft in Indonesia and Ethiopia. In addition, last April, a Southwest Airlines engine failure resulted in the first passenger fatality at a U.S. air carrier in over 9 years. On behalf of the Office of Inspector General, we grieve the victims of these accidents and express our deep condolences to their families. Secretary Elaine L. Chao, along with several members of Congress, including Senator Blumenthal, recently requested that my office audit FAA's certification process for the MAX 8 aircraft. We appreciate the Secretary's and your continued confidence in our independence and objectivity. We have already begun this work and will keep you informed on our results. Today, my statement will focus on our recent and ongoing work related to a number of important aviation safety challenges. First, FAA must take steps to reduce hazards associated with flight deck automation. Pilots now rely on automated flight systems as much as 90% of the time. While airlines have long used automation safely, FAA is responsible for ensuring air carriers meet requirements for these systems. This includes ensuring pilots are trained, tested, and proficient in the use of automation. Notably, FAA now requires U.S. commercial pilots to be trained in how to respond to abnormal flight conditions, such as recovering from a stall or other unexpected event. Air carriers should have implemented these requirements earlier this month. Providing effective oversight of this training will be vital to maintain the margin of safety. Second, FAA must remain vigilant as its systems and strategies for safety oversight evolve. Over the years, FAA has increasingly shifted toward working with industry to meet shared safety goals. For example, FAA now delegates more of its aircraft certification to approved manufacturers through its congressionally authorized Organization Designation Authorization Program, or ODA. However, my office has identified weaknesses with FAA's oversight of ODA. For example, in 2015, we reported that its oversight was not based on risk. In response to our recommendations, FAA plans to revamp its ODA oversight process by the end of July 2019. Sustained management attention will remain essential to ensure that ODA companies comply with safety regulations. In addition, FAA now requires air carriers to play a larger role in identifying and mitigating safety risks. For example, in 2015, FAA required U.S. commercial carriers to establish safety management systems to proactively manage risks. However, recent events, including last year's Southwest engine failure, have raised concerns that FAA's oversight may not ensure that carriers meet their responsibilities under these systems. FAA also introduced its new compliance program in 2015. The program calls for FAA to work with air carriers to address the root causes of safety violations rather than imposing enforcement actions. This is a significant change in the way FAA and the carriers conduct business. As it works to leverage both collaboration and enforcement, FAA must be able to accurately assess whether an air carrier is willing and able to take timely corrective actions. Finally, I want to note other critical safety areas that require FAA's attention. For example, FAA must continue its work to reduce safety risks in the air and on the ground at airports, including preventing near misses on the runway. In addition, FAA faces challenges in safely integrating unmanned aircraft systems in the same airspace as manned aircraft. Furthermore, FAA must protect its flight-critical and safety-critical IT systems from a growing number of cyber threats. And lastly, FAA can do more to ensure essential aircraft parts, such as landing gear, meet safety standards by carefully implementing the Suspected Unapproved Parts Program. As always, my office remains committed to supporting FAA and the Secretary as they work to maintain aviation safety and protect the traveling public. This concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate your testimony. Acting Administrator Elwell, although the investigations of both of these crashes are still ongoing, the investigators have gathered enough data to confirm similarities between the two crashes. The most prominent link seems to be a new software unique to the Boeing 737 MAX called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, more commonly known as MCAS. From the FAA's perspective, was there any information on this new MCAS system that was required to be included or was included in the, quote, short self-administered online course that pilots are required to go through before flying the MAX?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. The MCAS system is indeed, as I mentioned, of great attention in both of these tragic accidents. And the MCAS is actually a sub-device to a system called the speed trim system that is in the NG, in the prior 737. What the MCAS does is 737 MAX is a fly-by-wire aircraft. Fly-by-wire aircraft, the controls, the yoke, that controls the flight controls needs to feel right to a pilot. And so what the MCAS does is it gives inputs to the flight controls when necessary in a very thin envelope, thin piece of the flight envelope in certain regimes so that the pilots, the yoke feels exactly like it should. And in this case, the MCAS made the MAX feel exactly like the NG to fly. So for that reason, we gave it an amended type certificate because of its similarity to the NG, because of what the MCAS system aided the pilots in the feel and the fly of the airplane. And we have, for a certification of this type, a flight standardization board comprised of pilots from Europe, Canada, the United States, who come together and fly the aircraft that is being amended, in this case 737 NG, and the new aircraft. And they fly it and are monitored by engineers and experts specifically to see if they have or notice differences in the flight characteristics, the handling characteristics of the new airplane, because that would trigger us to need flight training for this new device.
Administrator Elwell, let me try to refocus you back on the specific question I asked, which is, was there any information on the MCAS that was included in the short self-administered online course that pilots were required to go through?
There was not specific instruction on the MCAS to my knowledge, specifically because it was not a system that went directly to what the pilots flew on the MAX, the difference between the MAX and the NG.
Well, that might be true in ordinary circumstances, but as I understand it, on previous versions of the 737, when the pilot pulled back on the yoke, it cut off the electronic control of the stabilizers. But with the MCAS, it did not. And presumably pilots would not know this if it was not included in their training and they were not made aware of that. Is that correct?
So, Senator, the MCAS gives input to the flight controls, as I said, in a very small flight envelope. In this case we're talking about here, errant information to that system would make it give input where it's not needed and where it's not wanted. And only in manual flight. And pilots are trained when they get an input into their flight controls that they did not ask for, that is not appropriate for the regime of flight, then they go through procedures. In this case, it's called runaway stabilizer trim procedure, and that is what would be done in this instance. In normal operation for the MCAS, you would never feel the input.
Did these pilots' training or procedure let them know that pulling back the yoke would not disengage this system?
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to about pulling back the yoke and stopping it, because that's not actually
So I'm reading a quote from the New York Times on February 3rd, 2019, where the Times reported older 737s had a way of addressing certain control problems with the stabilizers. Pulling back on the yoke or control column would cut off electronic control of the stabilizers, allowing the pilots to control them manually. And that was not true with the 737 MAX. Now, is that correct factually? I'm relying on the Times reporting here.
So I don't believe that's correct. The same ways to deal with the MCAS inappropriate input is the same thing a pilot would do for runaway stab trim for an NG. It's the same input and the same procedure. In fact, the procedure for runaway stab trim does not change from the NG to the MAX. It presents itself the same way, and it's dealt with the same way.
Now, the MCAS system itself relied on angle of attack sensors.
Yep.
That, as the Washington Post reported, quote, angle of attack sensors have been flagged as problems more than 50 times on U.S. commercial airplanes over the past 5 years. How did the FAA come to the conclusion that it was appropriate to certify an anti-stall software system, the MCAS, that not only drew data from a sensor that had a history of problems, but also that didn't have redundancy?
So the AOA vanes are an input to the MCAS system. The MCAS system is actually not an anti-stall system. It's not a system unto itself. It is a supplement to, as I said, the speed trim system that existed in the NG, does the same thing that this STS does in the NG. I am not aware of AOAs being a problem. 50 malfunctions of an AOA or 50 maintenance procedures to an AOA across the gamut of flight where AOA vanes and all of the flights that use AOA is not in the, you're talking about numbers of hundreds of thousands of flights.
Unless there's a system where the malfunction then causes the plane to crash, then that is a serious issue.
Well, sir, it is still yet to be determined if the malfunctioning of the AOA caused the crash. We actually don't know the cause of the crash. There's a lot more to find out through the investigation. But I am confident in, I'm confident in the AOA vanes that are produced and put on airplanes, and I'm confident in the MCAS system. Now, where we need to go is we need to get all the information, all the data from the accident to determine the interaction between all of them. And it isn't just airframe, or it isn't just the AOA, it isn't just the MCAS. There's quite a few more factors in any investigation that we have to determine. We have to gather the data. We're a data-driven organization, and we make our decisions based on the data collected, and we still have a lot of data to collect, sir.
Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Elwell, but I welcome responses from any of our guests. According to media reports, the initial failure classification for the MCAS enabled its safety evaluation to be delegated to Boeing. And according to media reports, during testing, FAA did not completely and properly review technical documents provided by Boeing. So how do we ensure that FAA can take over safety evaluation if issues are discovered during the testing and evaluation phase?
Thank you for that question, Senator. What you're referring to is the Organizational Designation Authority. In the course of a certification such as an amended type cert that the 737 MAX went through, the FAA determines what aspects of the delegation or what aspects of the certification can be delegated, and usually those are normal, well-known legacy type systems. And in the case of the 737 MAX, the FAA, retained MCAS for review at the beginning of the certification process. As the process goes on, ODA is amended and is amended many times in the course of a certification as the FAA reviews and certifies the expertise of the manufacturer to take on more of the delegated authority under very strict review by the FAA. And we, at times in the course of a certification, will find areas that we want to pay more attention to, and we will retain those items. So it is a active, constantly changing dynamic in a certification, and that's what happened during the certification of the MAX.
A second question then for you, Mr. Elwell. So MCAS is new to the Boeing MAX aircraft, and I was wondering if you could talk to us about why the system was not included in pilot training materials, and who makes a determination regarding what is included in pilot training materials?
So when we're doing a new certification, whether it's an amended or a new type, there's a flight standardization board that is a group of experts and pilots and engineers whose responsibility it is to determine, and in this case an amended type certificate, if the handling characteristics of the new aircraft require flight training, or if the differences between the new aircraft and the one that it's amending does not require flight training. What the MCAS did was correct for some very slight modifications that the MAX had. The MAX has slightly larger diameter engines with not a whole lot of extra thrust, similar thrust, but because of the width of the engines, they had to go forward on the wing. And because of the diameter of the engines, the nose wheel had to be extended 6 inches. These are not big changes as far as the FAA is concerned for an amended. But what we need to do is put pilots in simulators and fly the aircraft that's being amended and the new aircraft. And after many scenarios, flights in all regimes, sim flights in all regimes with these pilots, there was a consensus opinion from the pilots, the European, Canadian, American pilots, that there was no marked difference in the handling characteristics of these two aircraft. And that is what we need to determine what kind of flight training or not is needed. And there was, by the recommendation of the Flight Standardization Board, and understand this is a board that has been used dozens and dozens of times, and their unanimous opinion was flight training was not needed. And they didn't flight test the MCAS per se because, as I said, the MCAS is a device that is supplement to another system that is specifically designed for the yoke to feel correctly to the pilot in all regimes of flight.
My last question is for each of the witnesses, and I wonder if you have suggestions for legislative or regulatory changes that can ensure an aircraft is independently and appropriately evaluated for operational safety. Is there more we need to do?
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Yes, there may be. However, for me as Inspector General to offer suggestions today would be entirely premature. As you know, Secretary Chow, Senator Blumenthal, and other congressional requesters have asked my office to start at the very beginning, thinking of these as bookends. We want to look at the certification process. I can outline very quickly for you what that'll entail. We want to look at the key decisions made by FAA when certifying the airplane and the timeline. We want to determine when MCAS was added to the aircraft and why FAA approved it, or the extent of FAA's involvement in Boeing's decision to approve it. How FAA reached the decision that pilots did not need additional training, or that details about the new system did not need to be included in the airplane's manual. That's the first bookend. The second bookend, in my view, will be how FAA responded to the recent accidents, and that's specifically Senator Blumenthal's question. Clearly, confidence in FAA as the gold standard for aviation safety has been shaken. We can help provide information to the Secretary and to the Congress to determine how best to restore FAA to that position. The second bookend, we hope, will shed some light on the obvious question as to why FAA might have been the last. It was the last, in fact, safety regulator to decide to ground the 737 MAX. Other safety regulators around the world decided that in their role as safety regulators, they needed to drive risk to zero, and they did that by grounding the aircraft. Acting Administrator Elwell has testified that they were continuing the hunt for data in order to inform that decision. So that disparity, that apparent disparity in appreciation of the safety regulator's role should be another question I respectfully submit for the Congress and the Secretary. We hope to present information to all of you to help inform your decision-making.
Ranking Member Sinema, thank you for your question. The NTSB has looked at that issue as it relates to particular crashes. For example, coming out of the 2013 Asiana crash at San Francisco, we recommended that the FAA convene a special certification design review of how the Boeing 777 automated flight control system controls airspeed. And we wanted the FAA to look at that, and we've classified that recommendation as open, alternate, acceptable response. Coming out of the 787 battery fire event that we investigated that same year, we talked about the use of engineering designees. Since 1999, we've issued 8 recommendations to the FAA concerning the use of engineering designees. 3 are still open. The remaining 4 have been closed acceptably. We do want the FAA to provide certification engineers with written guidance, training to address opportunities to improve the certification process outcomes. And so that would be where we stand on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Elwell, you told Senator Sinema that part of certification was based on pilots flying simulators in multiple different scenarios. Did any of those scenarios include angle of attack sensors malfunctioning and reporting the wrong data to the MCAS system?
So I can get an answer for you on that, but I don't believe so. I believe that they were all in the full range of the flight envelope for flight characteristics. Again, the MCAS, the issue of an AOA vane giving the MCAS the wrong information, causing it to give nose down input to the stabilizer trim, presents as a scenario all pilots are trained on and familiar with. It's called runaway stabilizer trim, and the actions that they take to defeat it are the same as they would find in any other cause of a stab trim malfunction, which could be the motor going off when it shouldn't. So it is indistinguishable to the pilot.
Chairman Wicker.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Mr. Sumwalt, the Indonesian Civil Aviation Authority has issued a preliminary report. How long did that take after the crash of Lion Air?
The accident occurred, Senator, on October the 29th, and I believe the preliminary report was issued on November the 27th. So
Okay.
about 30 days.
Do you think we can expect a preliminary report then from Ethiopia within about a month?
I do. Our investigators are very engaged with the Ethiopian government. We're working very closely with them, providing assistance in the development of a draft report, and we do expect it in the very near future.
I assume you're getting all the cooperation you need from the Ethiopian government?
Yes, sir, we are.
From the Indonesian government?
Absolutely.
What do you know about the Lion Air crash that you don't know about Ethiopian Air at this point?
Well, I've read the Lion Air preliminary report that was issued in November. I will say a very ticklish issue is that there's a law, an actual law, 49 U.S.C. 1114, that prohibits anyone from disclosing information concerning a foreign investigation unless that information has been cleared by the host country. So I am not the one to speak about either of those two accidents.
Mr. Scovel, are you going to have a recommendation about that law? Do you have an opinion about that law? Is it a problem?
Conceivably, it might be. certainly in the desire of the Congress and the administration to foster transparency and determine best route ahead. At this point, I certainly don't have a recommendation for you.
Okay, well, if the witnesses would get back to us on that, we'd appreciate it. You have to have some time to consider that. Now, there was a nose-down input, Mr. Sumwalt. In other words, the pilots experienced the MCAS system kicking in and pushing the nose down. I understand it was some 21 times before the plane eventually crashed. Is that your understanding, sir?
Which accident are you referring to, sir?
Lion Air.
I think that's about right,
Okay,
based
and
on my reading.
Over what period of time would that have been?
I'm not sure, sir.
What should the pilots have done there?
Well, I flew the 737 for 10 years, and I do believe that there is a procedure, at least for the Flintstone version of the 737 I flew, a very old 737. But I do believe that the first thing you would do is oppose that motion by pulling the yoke back, and that should engage a stab brake. Now, apparently, that feature is not on the
Mr. Elwell, what should they have done? What should the pilot have done? Based on 21 times the system kicking in, pushing the nose down.
Mr. Chairman, I did not fly the 737, so I can only speak to the airplane, all the different airplanes I flew. But when you have,
I'm actually asking about this aircraft. Do you know? If you don't know, that's fine.
I'm sorry, I'd have to get back to you on the specific. There is a non-normal checklist, an NNC on runaways.
It would be helpful for us to know, based on the expertise at this table, what should have occurred in the cockpit based on that nose-down input. Mr. Elwell, then discuss, if you don't mind, the point that Mr. Scovel mentioned and that a lot of us have about the decision made by other countries initially to ground the aircraft. What data they had? Was this just an abundance of caution, or was it based on facts that these agencies had that we didn't have here in the United States? Help us understand the decision there.
Yes, sir. It's a very important question. The FAA, to make a decision to ground a fleet of aircraft, is going to do that on a data-based information that we have to warrant a grounding. I can't speak to the reasoning that the other nations took. I know that in communication with those countries, in our request, what data might they have, they did not have any data for us. In fact, there were several countries in communications with us who, after grounding the aircraft, asked us what data we had and what we might suggest for them for ungrounding when the time was right.
Was your decision based on data, or just
Our
the fact that
decision was
everybody else
based on
doing? And what was that data?
So on about Wednesday morning, mid-morning, we received data that gave us refined flight track. We had initial flight track data Monday that was unreliable, and it was actually, we were not able to interpret it and to create a flight track. That data was refined on Tuesday night into Wednesday by the company that actually produced the data or received the data through their satellite system. And with the help of the NTSB and Boeing, that data was refined to the point where we could have a flight track, a 6-minute flight track of the Ethiopian Air flight. And we found information on the ground that corroborated for us in a briefing on Wednesday morning that the flight track of Ethiopian Airlines was very similar to the flight track of Lion Air. And that data told us that there was very possibly a link between the two flights. And when you have the possibility of a link between two accidents of the same type aircraft, it's prudent to ground them until you find what that link is, mitigate that link. And the important thing to know about using data, we may have been, I think someone said, the last country to ground the aircraft, but the United States and Canada were the first countries to ground the aircraft with data for cause and purpose. And that's important because when you ground a fleet of aircraft for a reason, a definable reason, then you have something by which to unground them when you've mitigated that or you've solved it or you've found that link.
Mr. Chairman, I know we're over, but Mr. Sumwalt seems to be nodding his head. Are you in agreement with the approach that Mr. Elwell has outlined as having been taken by the FAA?
Well, the NTSB was not involved in the grounding decision. We supplied data that they could use to make that decision.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Elwell, did you say or answering an earlier question to Senator Sinema that the FAA retained the authority over the MCAS system, that it wasn't delegated?
I said that it originally we retained it as a new system and then released it to the ODA, to the delegation, designation.
So if someone is characterizing it as delegated, then it was delegated.
Right. So initially, as a new system or a new device on the amended type certificate, we retained the oversight of that, and then over time released that to the ODA when we had the comfort level and the oversight, and we've examined it thoroughly, and we were able to assure that the ODA members of Boeing had the expertise and the knowledge of the system to continue going forward.
And so that kind of information is something you can make available to members now, or is that something that will be part of the investigation?
I'm sure, Senator, that we could get that information to you on exactly the timing and how that went. And of course, in the investigations and the audits that are ongoing about the certification process here, this will all be very transparent and clear.
Well, I do think transparency is important.
Absolutely.
And so I read statements where you're saying it wasn't delegated, or I hear your answer here, and then I read things in the press that say it was delegated, and I think the public wants to understand this whole system, and obviously Mr. Scovel and various IG reports is reviewing that, and I appreciate those reports and that review. And I, as I mentioned in my opening statement, appreciate Secretary Chow convening some experts of aviation analysis to also look at that system and review. So anyway, we'll look forward to getting that information from you on what that looked like as the FAA retained that oversight, and then once they were certain, then delegated. I'm not sure what they delegated, but you will get that to us. This larger question in my mind is, Mr. Scovel also mentioned that it is that pilots rely on automated flight systems, that the FAA ensure that carriers meet its requirements to train pilots on how to respond to abnormal flight conditions. And I think you also, Mr. Scovel, mentioned stall situations. So how is the FAA making sure that that is achieved, in particularly this area of human and machine interface? I think that the public wants to understand, and I think it's probably across a lot of transportation sectors, want to understand what we're doing on testing to make sure that these safety factors of functionality are there, particularly when the functionality is between a machine and a machine and a human interface. How are we testing for that? And in this case, how are we testing?
Yes, Senator. The FAA is intensely interested in the interface between the pilot and the machine. And over time, that relationship has changed. And as aircraft become more automated, we have this. Clearly, automation is one of the most important aspects for the amazing increase and improvement in safety we've seen over decades. But automation brings with it certain challenges. And as the IG has pointed out, if most of the time automation is on in an aircraft, there's always been this concern that, well, then pilot skills degrade. So when I was flying in the airlines, we had, within the airline itself, we had some rules about making sure that you hand flew frequently enough to keep that sharpness. But certainly, we look very, very closely at the training requirements and the human interface and what automation does, the safety benefits, and what the challenges are with it. So we watch that very closely.
And so you think there was enough of that training involved here?
Oh, Senator, I do. Because the MCAS, remember, the MCAS operates in manual mode. It's not an automated, it's not with autopilot on. It actually, as I said earlier, it makes its whole purpose is to give the pilot the proper feel with a fly-by-wire yoke while he or she is flying. So it interjects in manual mode. It does not interject in automatic mode. And as I said, when that MCAS is doing things that it's not supposed to do, pilots feel it. It presents itself as uncommanded pitch trim, and pilots of large aircraft are trained from the beginning of their careers how to handle that.
Well, I mentioned this, and I mentioned the Colgan Air families who were here, because I think that's been their main mantra, that there wasn't enough training on that particular system, or at least from a co-pilot perspective. And I think I saw that Captain Sully had also made similar comments recently. We've had a lot of debate here about this as it relates to making sure that two pilots are. But I really do want to understand the FAA's role, and certainly Mr. Scovel's review of that human-machine interface, because my guess is we're going to continue to move forward, but we have to get this right. We have to get this right. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elwell, as you know, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 contained several bipartisan provisions aimed at improving and modernizing FAA's aircraft certification process, to include the establishment of an Organization Designation Authorization Office within FAA's Office of Aviation Safety, designed to improve operational safety by strengthening oversight of ODA holders delegated to perform certain functions on behalf of FAA. Could you provide a timeline on when you expect this office to be fully established?
Thanks for that question, Senator Thune. Absolutely. In fact, we already established the new ODA office, as you mentioned, prescribed in last year's FAA bill. On March 5th, we created and stood up the office.
And as a follow-up, the FAA bill also established an expert review panel to survey ODA holders and evaluate the effectiveness of the ODA process. Do you have an update on when you expect this review panel to be established?
I don't have it off the top of my head, Senator, but I will certainly get that information to you. It may already be in place, but I don't have that in my notes.
Thank you. That would be great if you could get us that information. Boeing recently, and I would direct this to you, Mr. Elwell, too, Boeing recently stated that the 737 MAX series aircraft was certified, and I quote, certified in accordance with the identical FAA requirements and processes that have governed certification of all previous new airplanes and derivatives, end quote. Could you provide some examples of other aircraft models where the FAA has certified a variant aircraft in a manner similar to the process that was used for the 737 MAX?
Well, Senator, the process to determine whether it is an amended type certificate or a new type is the same, regardless of the manufacturer, the type to which you're amending or making that determination. And it goes to the points I made earlier about flyability. So first and foremost, that the criteria is examined as to whether there's a fundamental difference in the thrust, weight, flight characteristics of the applicant for an amended type. Those, as I said, are tried and true methods that we've used for decades on amended certificates. I know sometimes, in my case, when I flew the Super 80, we added to our fleet type the Super 80s from another airline in a merger. They had a different cockpit layout, but the plane was fundamentally the same. There's a couple of different options, but it handled the same. So it was an amended type, and we went through differences training because the flight deck had some different things in it that we needed to get used to. But that's the fundamental things that the fundamental things that we look at.
That you look at. So as a follow-up, was there anything specific about the design of the 737 MAX that differentiates the model certification process from some of those examples that you just mentioned?
Well, sir, the 737 MAX, it is and required certainly an amended type certificate. And again, primarily because of the new modern complexities that it brought to the table. It did bring the MCAS into the equation, but the MCAS was a supplement or an addition to a system that already existed in the NG. The engine position on the wing was different, and it's what required, actually. It's what necessitated the addition of MCAS. And there were some differences in the screens, what was on the screens, but fundamentally, the aircraft layout, the handling, and the performance of the aircraft was the same, and thus the decision to make it an amended type certificate.
Okay. Mr. Sumwalt, you mentioned in your testimony both the benefits and safety concerns related to the integration of UAS into the nation's airspace. As you know, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 included numerous provisions related to the safe operation of this emerging technology. Are there any pending regulatory actions at the FAA in particular that you see as most important to ensuring the safe integration of drones into our airspace?
Thank you for that question, Senator Thune. As you're aware, the FAA recently enacted Part 107 to the Federal Aviation Regulations, which imposes more regulatory requirements for drone operators, and we see that as a positive.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your willingness to be here today. Take questions.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you. The two tragic airplane crashes included, by the way, those dead was a beloved community member from St. Cloud, Minnesota, Muhammad Hussein, and I know his family is grief-stricken. And following these crashes, as many of my colleagues has talked about, it is very important that we figure out our certification process and get it right so we can prevent similar tragedies in the future. Mr. Elwell, I know you've been asked about this, but let me try it a different way. Are there any safety measures the FAA may have miscalculated when evaluating the safety features of the Boeing 737 MAX?
Senator Klobuchar, thank you for that question. We certify aircraft in a way that we have refined, as I said, for large aircraft, large commercial aircraft. It's been refined 130 times, over 130 times since we started doing these. In every certification, we learn something new. From every IG audit, from every,
Was this consistent with how you've done other certifications in other situations, the Boeing situation?
Yes, ma'am. This was an amended type certification that followed the procedures we used to determine and then to execute amended type certificates.
But if you learn something else after this investigation or other things come out, you may change that process.
Absolutely. That's how we get better.
And Mr. Scovel, what is your office's timeline for this audit?
Thanks, Senator. We always shoot for 10 months. This is a very tall order for us, as I'm sure you can appreciate. We have a highly skilled team of aviation safety auditors who will all turn to. If we can meet 10 months, I'd optimistically say great. It may well be some months after that. We will get to it as soon as we possibly can because we truly appreciate your interest on all these matters.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Elwell, back to you. According to a recent New York Times article, Boeing charged airlines extra for critical safety features. These were optional add-ons. Following the crashes, does the FAA plan to update the requirements for aircraft safety features or take other action to mandate that these features are not optional?
Mm-hmm. Well, Senator Klobuchar, when we certify an aircraft, whether it's amended or a new type, critical safety features, that's an important term. If something is a critical safety feature on an aircraft, a passenger aircraft that we certify, it's not optional. So critical safety features are part of the certification package. And I think what you're referring to is AOA displays on the CRTs in the cockpit. And I can tell you, as a pilot who's flown aircraft, several aircraft in the military and the civilian world. I had aircraft that had AOA displays in the cockpit, and I had aircraft that didn't. And it all depends on what the rest of the display says. In today's modern airplanes, and you've got 12-inch CRTs in the cockpit.
But is it possible this could be decided that these aren't just optional, that they should be mandatory if it's discovered after these investigations?
Absolutely.
Okay, and then do you know estimate of how many safety features that the FAA lists as optional right now that detect sensor malfunctions? Are there ones, or could you tell it to me later in writing?
I could tell to you later, Senator Klobuchar.
All right. Chairman Sumwalt, what role does the U.S. play in setting international safety standards when it comes to training for foreign pilots? I know you'd answered some questions about training from my colleagues, but do we have any role there? I'm just thinking because we had someone from Minnesota was killed. And
Sure, Senator Klobuchar, and we are, as I've mentioned, we are a member state to the International Civil Aviation Organization that sets recommended practices and standards, and so it would be ICAO that would outline those international training standards that other member states would be expected to comply with.
And could you weigh in on those training standards?
We could. The FAA is officially the U.S. representative to ICAO, but we work closely with them with our relationship with ICAO.
I see. So you would be involved in that, Mr. Elwell?
Yes, Senator, we would.
Okay. I'll follow up on that later. One last question I had of you, Chairman Sumwalt. In your testimony, you highlighted reducing fatigue-related accidents as one of NTSB's most wanted transportation safety improvements for 2019 to 2020. As you know, I've led the Safe Skies Act, supported by Captain Sullenberger, among many, along with Senator Cantwell, Blumenthal, Markey, and Duckworth, to take the rest requirements that we put in place for passenger pilots and apply them to cargo pilots. This is something unrelated to these two crashes, but part of airline safety and something that I know the Colgan families have also supported. So could you comment on that?
Absolutely. I want to thank you and Senator Blumenthal for your advocacy on that. The NTSB does not agree that there should be a different standard for passenger carrying airlines and cargo airlines with respect to the fatigue rules. The FAA, as you know, did enact a fatigue rule in 2012 for passenger carriers. It did not relate to cargo carriers, and we disagree with that disconnect.
Okay. Well, I hope you win. So we're going to keep pushing for this bill.
Thank you.
Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you for conducting this hearing. Press and media reports, Mr. Elwell, indicate that Boeing was implementing changes in the MAX after the first crash, and that is at least an explanation for why they may be close to having a, quote, fix for that MAX. Is there anything, a requirement that, first of all, is the FAA notified of that effort to make corrections to the MAX after the first crash?
Senator, yes, the Boeing company submitted an application for a software update to the MCAS, an MCAS software update after the Lion Air accident.
And is there a corresponding duty to warn, either on the part of Boeing Corporation or the FAA, either pilots or airlines, a duty to warn or a notification that there may be something wrong and a fix is on its way?
So 9 days after the Lion Air accident, the FAA put out an emergency airworthiness directive, followed by a communique to all authorities around the world who fly the MAX. And what we pointed out was, I'll back up a little bit, the FAA's role, primary role in any accident investigation, is for continual operational safety. In other words, if in the course of an accident something of immediate import is discovered, we don't wait for the end of the accident for the final report. We act immediately. And in this case, the initial data suggested that a reminder was needed, and that's what the emergency AD was. Reminder was needed for pilots and operators of this aircraft to apply standard runaway stab trim procedures should this be encountered. And that's what the emergency AD was. Now, the software update that you're referring to is Boeing came to us with this, and we talked to them about it. We accepted their application. They began work. But we determined that the issues that this software update was making, or the things that it was improving upon for MCAS, did not warrant anything more than the announcement that this was in progress.
Okay, Mr. Elwell, I'll stay with you for a moment longer. I suppose that there's always a question of why we would have a private company certify their product. In this instance, it happens in the aviation world. It happens all the time. What's the justification for that? We use ODAs, Organization Designation Authorizations, regularly. Would the FAA be able to certify aircraft without the use of that designation?
Senator Moran, that is a very important question, but let me go back to what you said in the question, that we allow companies to certify their own craft.
I know I've misspoken in the way that you would phrase it, and I understand the distinction. I'm not trying to discount the importance of an ODA. In fact, I'm hoping that you'll confirm to me the importance, with proper oversight, with FAA certification required, the actions that are taken by private companies to provide the information necessary to certify is important, and how would we do this in aviation without that process?
So the concept of ODA has, as I said, it's been around for 60 years, and some form of delegation has been around since the 20s. It is part of the fabric of what we've used to become as safe as we are today. And I don't want to give the impression that ODA is some resource, a way for us to sort of stretch our resources. We have very strict oversight on every participant in an ODA program, and we make sure that they are experts in the field, that they have the appropriate understanding of FAA regs and manuals, they have professional integrity is checked, everything. But to your point, if we had no ODA at all, it would, an estimation, it would require roughly 10,000 more employees and to do that role at the FAA, and about $1.8 billion for our certification office in the FAA.
How does that compare with that process, that designation process, compare to Europe and other across the globe when it comes to the use of that process?
So it's another excellent question. The European Aviation Safety Agency is the next biggest certification body in the world, and they leverage ODA much more than we do. So it's used around the world.
In this arena, there's nothing unusual to this process. It's been ongoing a long time and used globally. Is that true?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the leadership of the committee for having this hearing. Thank you for being here today, gentlemen, and I want to thank particularly the Inspector General, Calvin Scovel. We're lucky to have a professional of your caliber doing this investigation, and I look forward to the results. I've been deeply disappointed, in fact, shocked that in grounding these aircraft, American safety officials, in effect, lagged instead of led the world. The same information was available to our FAA as was accessible to every other country that grounded its airline days ahead of us, and that put American passengers in peril. But as important, maybe more so, is the system that led to, in effect, outsourcing safety to the manufacturers of these aircraft. Call it delegation or shifting, as you did. The fact is that the FAA decided to do safety on the cheap, which is neither cheap nor safe, and put the fox in charge of the henhouse. That was true of the 737 MAX 8. In its rush to produce that aircraft, because of competition from Airbus, critical safety features were disregarded. And I'm going to be introducing legislation that will reform this system, which is so fatally riddled with flaws. There needs to be rigorous reform so that the FAA is put back in charge of safety. You said, Mr. Elwell, that the system is fact-based and data-driven. The FAA should have the facts and should be driving the data and making decisions. If the manufacturer has the facts and the data, not the FDA, if its employees, chosen, hired, paid, fired by the manufacturer, are the ones making these critical decisions, and the FAA lacks all of the facts and data necessary to properly oversee them and overrule them, this system of oversight is failing. I will tell you, I read some of the pilot reports. They're public. NASA has them. They provided them to me. They are chilling. If I'd been a passenger on one of those planes and I knew about these incidents, I would have wanted a parachute. Pilots of the airlines struggled to regain control of those aircraft in the same way that the pilots of the fatally crashed aircraft did. They succeeded, the others didn't. So I look forward to your support for legislation that will fundamentally change this flawed system. Mr. Elwell, have you reviewed those pilot reports?
Senator, thank you for your comments. I reviewed the reports. There were...
Did you review them at the time that they were received by NASA?
The reports, I did not personally. The reports were reviewed as they were written and received. There were 24 reports. They're called...
Were they reported to you after the first crash? Because many of them followed the first crash.
The ASRS reports were reviewed and compared against the FDR data or FOQA data that we look at. ASRS reports are reports from pilots on experiences when they, on a trip. We take them very seriously. We review them. We have event review teams that sit down with the pilot, and none of the 24 reports associated with the MAX related to the MCAS or related to what the pilots experienced in either accident.
I'm going to provide you with the reports that were given to me.
Sir.
And my time is limited here. Let me just ask you, were you contacted by anyone in the administration before making your decision to ground those aircraft?
From the moment, Senator, of the Ethiopian accident until we grounded on Wednesday morning, I kept Secretary Chao and the President briefed and fully apprised on all of our activities, which included, I would add, a full
Did she order you to ground the aircraft?
I'm sorry?
Did she order you or otherwise recommend what your decision should be in grounding the aircraft?
Oh, Senator, the decision to ground, to make an emergency grounding of a fleet of aircraft is vested in the FAA. I made that decision.
And one last question. I don't know whether you've seen a ProPublica report. It's just come to my attention. I think it came out today, which reports your contacts with airlines. Could you provide us copies of the emails between yourself and industry representatives, and also a copy of your financial disclosure forms? I understand you had a consulting business while you were part of the FAA. Is that correct?
That's not correct, Senator. I'm happy to supply any and all communications.
I want to give you a full opportunity to respond to the article. It's just been provided to me, but it says that on those financial disclosure forms you reported some income as a special government employee while you were member of the FAA.
Happy to provide it,
Thank you.
any and all information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Elwell, I think established in the questions with Senator Moran the long history of delegating certification. Let me ask a couple more questions about that. The Seattle Times recently reported that FAA technical experts and safety engineers said in interviews that they were urged to delegate more responsibility to Boeing during the 737 MAX certification process or to speed it up. Does the FAA still retain the mandate to certify aviation technologies that are new or novel?
Yes, Senator, we do. That is our authority, and it's our sole authority. We do not allow self-certification of any kind.
Were there any deviations from that policy in regards to the Boeing 737 MAX?
Sir, none of which I'm aware. We have a very good whistleblower program at the FAA. We encourage all levels of employees to report any activity that they find that doesn't go with our safety culture. And I looked into this personally. There were no comments made by employees to our knowledge. I can't speak to the Seattle Times article.
And it's your view that FAA managers did conduct the kind of reviews of that delegated authority that they're expected to conduct?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Well, let's go back to the investigation going on right now. I think, Mr. Sumwalt, you said that we were cooperating closely with the investigation, the Ethiopian investigation. Is that cooperating closely? Is that the right phrase?
Well, I'd actually say we are actively engaged. We have investigators on the ground in Ethiopia that are assisting and advising the Ethiopian government, as well as helping them to put together a draft interim report.
All right, are they cooperating closely with you then?
Yes, sir, they are.
And are you getting access to all the information you'd like to have access to?
At this time, we are.
I know it's a much smaller agency than your agency in terms of budget and size and experience. How would you compare this investigation to other investigations you've been involved in? And what are you doing to make up differences if there are differences?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, because I'm not. The NTSB has a lot of experience with investigating crashes. We've been in business for 52 years. So we have a lot of experience. But as an accredited representative to foreign investigations, we often find that other countries do not have the resources that we do. So we are very experienced with working with other countries, other states, to help them. And I think that this investigation is going as it should. The Ethiopians, again, this is like I wasn't bragging, and this next statement is not a derogatory statement. They don't have the experience that we have because they haven't investigated the number of crashes that we have over the years. They're a relatively new agency. So they are proceeding very deliberately and very cautiously.
There was another comment made earlier about a prohibition unless information's been cleared by the host country. I believe the way I heard that was for you to share that information with others. Does that suggest that there's information that's not being shared with you?
I have no indication at all that the Ethiopians are not sharing with us the information that we need to make sure that we are aware of the safety-related information that we need to feed back to the FAA or feed back to Boeing to ensure continued airworthiness safety.
And those earlier comments were about whether you could publicly share that information without the host government agreeing with that. Is that right?
That is correct. However, the law does further state that nothing in this subsection shall restrict the board at any time from referring to a foreign accident investigation information in making safety recommendations. So in other words, if we identify safety-related information, that we need to make a safety recommendation, then we can use that information. But we would always want to coordinate that ahead of time with the state of occurrence.
So you don't feel unduly restricted by that prohibition of releasing information?
I do not, but it is, and to be clear, as you characterized it, it is for the public release of information is what the law is specifically calling for.
That's helpful for me. Mr. Scovel, do you want to comment on that?
Thank you, Senator Blunt. Not on that particular question. Thanks for recognizing my signal just for a moment. I may have information that may help you and the committee in understanding the Seattle Times point that you mentioned in an earlier question. And I want to refer back to our 2015 audit report on ODA. In the course of that work, we reviewed 4 ODA company self-audits that identified employee concerns about undue pressure, which could lead to rushing safety-critical tasks to meet production schedules. Now, I want to clarify, these were not U.S. DOT Inspector General audits. These were company self-audits that are required by FAA as part of its oversight process for ODA. It's unclear to us what FAA may have known about those company self-audits because I mentioned there were 4 of them. 2 involved Boeing, in fact, one in the Seattle area dating to 2013. The other was from Boeing's Charleston, South Carolina facility in 2014. The remaining 2 concerned Bell Helicopter, both in Fort Worth, 2013 and 2014. We didn't step into the shoes of the safety regulator. It's not in our lane to do that. But when we learned about the self-audits, we determined that it would be appropriate for us to make a recommendation to FAA that they find the best way to use those company self-audits in order to enhance their oversight of the company's ODA processes.
When would you have made that recommendation?
That was in 2015, sir.
And Mr. Elwell, do you know what the follow-up from FAA was on that recommendation?
I can help you on that too, sir. I'll pass to my colleague to take an answer on that. But I also have what is the auditor's answer as well.
And what was it?
We made the recommendation. FAA concurred. They took action to our satisfaction to address the recommendation, the intent behind it. And so we closed that recommendation. What remains to be done, and this is typical audit process, is to see how it's effectively implemented going forward. So when we close our recommendation, it means that the agency is poised to execute, but it may, in some cases, be a matter of years before we return to see the effectiveness of that implementation.
Mr. Elwell, do you want to add anything?
I'd like to thank the Inspector General. We did an audit of our whistleblower program, and so I need to go back and look at this self-audit information that General Scoville's talking about. And
you'll respond to the record with what you find?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Elwell, I want to touch on the training aspect of pilots in general, of aircraft certified by the FAA, and then also about the specific MAX 8 aircraft. Would it be a true statement to say that U.S. pilots properly trained would know how to respond to an uncommanded nose-down pitch rate on an aircraft with an automated stabilizer system? I'll give you an example. I flew the Black Hawk.
Yes, ma'am.
It went through this and it went through a real problem at the beginning of its development. And to this day, I know the procedure for uncommanded nose-down rate, right? Mm-hmm. So I know it by heart. I will always know it until the day I die. Is that something that most pilots would be able to basically say, what those steps are, those memory items, if they're properly trained under U.S. system?
Yes, Senator Duckworth, that our American U.S. trained pilots on large commercial aircraft know that procedure. Mm-hmm. And if I might,
yes,
I wanted to amplify what we were doing prior to the grounding on Wednesday. One of the things I was doing, is talking to the heads of all of the pilot groups that flew the MAX and asking, did they have reservations about the MAX? This is in addition to data we got from over 50,000 MAX flights in North America, Canada and the US. And in those data reports, and those are data reports that coming right off the airplane, there was not a single case in North America of an MCAS malfunction or what we found happened in Lion Air. But that wasn't enough. I called and talked to the presidents of SWAPA, the Southwest Airline Pilots Organization, ALPA, over 53,000 pilots, and APA, the American Pilots Group, and asked them, what is your experience flying the MAX? What are your pilots saying? And they said, to a person, to a group, we are absolutely confident in the safety of this aircraft and our pilots' level of training in flying it. If I hadn't had that information, the data and the affidavits from those unions or from those pilot groups, I would not have been able, that's part of the data package I had to wait for the data from the accidents to justify a grounding.
Let me then ask you about, so we talked a bit about just responding to an uncommanded nose-down attitude. That aside, there's another procedure. This is my experience as a Black Hawk pilot. We have the stabilator that would slew down, killed a bunch of pilots, hurt a bunch of people. But the automated control system, the basic procedure is reset. If it doesn't reset, turn it off, manual control. Slew to 0 if you're above 40 knots indicated airspeed, flew down if you're below. I know nothing you ever flew ever went as slow as 40 knots indicated airspeed as I did, as slow and low pilots. The question I have for you is, while the MCAS is not specifically referenced in the aircraft manual for the MAX 8, the procedure to shut off stabilizer trim switches are in the manual as a response to this. Is that correct? And this is something that American pilots would be trained on?
Yes, ma'am.
Is this something that FAA, through ICAO, would ensure that other pilots in other countries would also be trained on?
When we interact at ICAO, it is usually not to the specificity of a fleet type, but we do use our influence at ICAO, and our influence at the International Civil Aviation Organization is substantial, and we use it at any opportunity we get to raise the safety level around the world. In fact, we don't have the final reports on either of these accidents, but I have already set in motion at the FAA activities to go to the assembly, and as you know, I'm sure ICAO meets every 3 years, and we're already examining what we bring to the assembly this year, our country, our pilots, to help raise the safety bar, which is, as you know, we're responsible for aviation safety in the United States, but it's a globe, there are no boundaries, there's no borders, it's a global endeavor. We care deeply how other countries, and we have over 100 technical assistance agreements around the world. We have 20 bilateral aviation safety agreements with 47 countries. We're very, very passionate, not just about safety in the U.S., but that every country raises their safety bar.
So are you saying that we need to look at strengthening the International Aviation Safety Assessment Program, and do you plan on doing that in the next ICAO meeting?
The International Aviation Safety Assessment Program, I think, is sound. It's very good, the IASA that we do with countries around the world. Because what we do is we evaluate the Civil Aviation Authority. And a healthy Civil Aviation Authority tells you that that country has a good culture for everything, airports, pilots, airlines. But by working to help raise the standards overall, then when we do an IASA in a country and we do a rating, we'll be rating against higher standards. And I think that's appropriate and it's well worth our attention.
Thank you. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here. Mr. Elwell, let me just make sure I understand exactly, because some of the questioning from Senator Duckworth is similar to what I was going to ask you. So the plane, the 737 MAX 8 with the MCAS, has been flying since 2017. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you said, and I have a report here that says, in the wake of the airworthiness directive and discovery of possible issue with MCAS on Boeing 737,
MAX. This is from, quoted from an article in Bloomberg, I believe. It says, a number of pilot groups raised concerns over whether or not pilots had been sufficiently made aware of the system that is unique to that aircraft. Did you just say that nobody had raised issues about this system previous to either one of these accidents, or maybe in between the two of them?
No, Senator, what I was remarking upon is we look at the data that comes off aircraft. It's called FOCO data, and please don't ask me what that acronym, the letters mean. But what that is data that literally comes off the flight data recorder. It's ones and zeros that come off of aircraft. And airlines get that data. They use that data in their safety management systems. And when we ask for that data and we ask for it to be filtered on certain parameters, they give that data to us. And what I'm saying is there were no incidents of MAX flights in North America. There was no incident of this happening. Now, when I say that also that the pilot reports that Senator Blumenthal mentioned earlier, the ASRS or the NASA reports, I personally read, there were 24 of them. I read every one of them. And I'm not the key expert in this determination, but they were all looked at and determined, and I concurred, none of them went to the MCAS. None of them demonstrated an MCAS malfunction. Okay. And that's what I meant. Now, what you're referring to.
What am I referring to?
Senator, I believe what you're referring to is when the accident first happened, there were some pilots who said, we would have liked to have read about that MCAS. We would like to have known that wasn't in the manual. And one of the things that we did in our emergency AD was direct to have MCAS explained in the flight operating manual.
Okay, so that was in between the first accident and the second accident. Okay, then let me ask you then about the training then that occurred after that. It's given in a short, self-administered online course. How does that work? Does that are you in a testing center? Mm-hmm. Are you on your own in your own laptop and you just check box, box, box? How's that administered? How is a self-admitted, I mean, we've all taken self-administered computer tests. How do you ensure that this is absorbed and that the person actually taking it is the person taking it?
Well, first of all, as a former pilot myself, I will tell you that isn't, when you go through differences training, and that's what that is, differences training, mm-hmm. That isn't something you pencil whip, because it's the aircraft you fly.
Right.
And our pilots in the United States are incredible professionals. Now, they can do that. They can do that when they go to the academy, when they go to the schoolhouse for their respective airline. They can do that in recurrent training. They can do it in initial training. I imagine, and although I can't tell you now if this is the case, that they could also do it on their computers at home. But all of that training has a test at the end, a quiz at the end, the test for knowledge. And the important thing to note here is that the determination was made because of the flying characteristics of the MAX versus the NG, that this iPad training that you read about was what was needed by pilots to be able to fly the MAX.
So then that is was that required then in between the two?
That was
in
always,
the United States?
It was always required.
It was always required.
Yes, ma'am.
Let me ask you about another sort of thing that you've seen out in the press, and I don't really have it specifically here, in terms of the fix to the airplane, that there are certain fixes that are going to be offered to certain airlines, and that may be different pricing, and how much is it going to be. There's been sort of a conflicting story in the media. How do you respond to that? Do you know anything about that?
So, Senator, I read those reports, or I read those articles, and those I don't believe were characterized as fixes. Those are options. When an airline or anybody purchases an airplane, like anything else, there are options. As I was explaining before, if it is a safety critical display in the cockpit and we certify it, it's required. It's not an option.
Right.
So, you know, AOA displays, some airlines and some pilots and pilot training groups, for instance, the Navy, loved AOA displays in their cockpits. Mm-hmm. The Air Force, not so much. It is a matter of every piece of real estate in a cockpit is precious. And you put one gauge up there, you're sacrificing another.
Right.
And these are important distinctions, and in this case, those displays are not safety critical because there are other ways for pilots to gauge their energy state. And that's what an AOA gauge does. It tells you your energy state.
Well, not understanding the technicalities of it, I would say that being a member of the general flying public, it's hard to believe that a safety item that could possibly be connected to taking down 2 jets and killing over 300 people would ever be characterized as any kind of an option.
Right.
So I want you to have the chance to, and I understand it is more technically involved than what I'm representing, but that's how it's perceived to the flying public. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Markey.
Mr. Elwell, as the safety agency entrusted to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world, the FAA must ensure that aviation safety is not a luxury that can be bought and sold for an extra fee. But for Boeing, critical safety features that could have saved the lives of 346 souls on 2 of their 737 MAX 8s were yet another profit center, deemed optional, like premium seats or extra bathrooms or fancy lighting. That's wrong, just plain wrong, Mr. Elwell. Boeing sold 2 safety features, the angle of attack indicator and the warning lights, to the airlines for an additional fee, not as a standard part of the aircraft. These features could have alerted the pilots and aviation mechanics that the doomed aircraft had faulty sensors, which preliminary findings suggest are the cause of these 2 aviation disasters. Let's be clear. In our automobiles, we don't pay more for seat belts, for airbags, or in medicine for child-proof caps. Those aren't optional. Those are all built in as safety features to protect people, to protect families. And so should all critical safety features on aircraft. Administrator Elwell, do you believe that Boeing's practice of selling the angle of attack indicator and warning lights as separate optional features may have contributed to the Lion Air and Ethiopian airline crashes? Yes or no?
Well, Senator, thank you for that question. The AOA indicator, the AOA vane is not an optional piece of equipment on the airplane. We look in the certification process that we've been using for decades, that we've refined over 130 times, is geared towards one thing: the safest possible aircraft.
Should all of these safety features been mandatory that could have alerted pilots and mechanics to issues with the sensors? Should they have been mandatory? Yes or no?
Senator, safety critical pieces of equipment on an aircraft are mandatory. That's what certification does. If it's safety critical.
So you don't think that they should have been mandatory? Is that what you're saying? Is that what you just said? They should not have been mandatory?
Sir, I'm saying that any
yes
safety
or no?
critical.
Should they have been mandatory? Yes or no?
Sir, the distinction between what goes in a flight deck and what stays out is a discussion, and whether or not a display is safety critical or not is a distinction that FAA is qualified to make.
Do you believe that charging additional fees for these safety features and other safety features like backup fire extinguishers in the cargo hold and oxygen masks for flight crews may discourage airlines from equipping their airlines with important safety systems? Yes or no?
Well, Senator Markey, I find it hard to believe that a safety company like an airline would save a couple $1,000s on an option that might improve safety on a
it may be hard for you to believe, but it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, the safety agency has a responsibility to make sure that an airline doesn't place
Absolutely.
profit over people's safety. Do you agree with that?
Senator Markey, I would tell you that
Do you think the FAA has the responsibility to tell these airlines that they cannot shortchange safety for profits when it's clear that that safety device plays a huge role in protecting the plane and its passengers?
Senator
Yes or
Markey,
no?
that is our fundamental responsibility.
Yes
And
or no? Should that be mandatory?
Senator Markey, the fundamental role of the FAA is to determine what the safety critical aspects of every part on that airplane.
Should the FAA ban the practice of airlines selling safety features a la carte to the airlines? Yes or no?
Senator Markey, I will tell you that if there is any manufacturer that sells a safety critical part a la carte, we will not permit it.
Well, if you change the rules so that they cannot do this, then that will be progress. But if business as usual continues, then passengers are going to continue to be vulnerable. So from my perspective, safety should never be a la carte. Safety should never be optional. Safety should always be mandatory. And that's why I have sent a letter with 16 of my colleagues to Boeing demanding that they never again have any safety option as something that is discretionary with their own profit model. It is absolutely unacceptable. And it's unacceptable for the FAA to delegate to an airline what is safe, what is not, what they can afford, what they cannot. This should not be an option. Seatbelts, airbags, or whatever in an airline should never be optional. So my view is that until the FAA finally stands up and says that this is something that must change, then we are going to have problems, big problems. And that's why I'm introducing legislation with my colleagues to ensure that this never happens again, and that when something is determined to be a safety feature, that it no longer is an option for the airline to include it, or else we will just continue to see continued repetition of what is happening, because ultimately, overconfidence breeds complacency, and complacency breeds disaster. We've seen it here, and we'll see it again unless we mandate safety as something which is not optional. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. You know, I spent most of my career working as a computer programmer and systems analyst with a focus on software. In fact, in the 1980s, I worked for Hughes Aviation, working out of the General Aviation Terminal in Las Vegas, helping them write programming that would assist in airplane maintenance and inventory. So from that perspective, I am very concerned about what I've read and heard regarding the software for the 737 MAX 8s and MAX 9s. Pilots have told me that there is significantly more new software on these planes than usual. And this is because the planes don't actually fly like a 737 without the software. The physics of the plane is just a little bit different. So, Mr. Scovel, let's talk a little bit about new certification. Is this really a 737, or does it require a new original certificate? And given that this plane, which is equipped with highly advanced software and is flying today in 2019, I just want to say today, 2019, is flying off an original certificate that was issued, and I'm sure you know this well, in 1967. The Beatles were the top of the charts in 1967. No cell phones, no technology, very different. So different kind of plane. So do you think there could be some loopholes in the current certification system that makes it perhaps a little bit too easy for an airplane manufacturer to continue to buy this or get a new original certificate? And I want to ask one other thing. If you can, or supply this in writing, can you tell us how many derivative certificates that have been issued for the 737 since it's originally been certified over 50 years ago? It kind of seems like we had a canoe in 1967, and today you're certifying a cruise ship. They're not the same.
Thank you, Senator. To your second question, I will defer to Mr. Elwell. I believe he and FAA are in a better position than I am or my office to give you that
I'd
particular
like,
number.
you could supply that in writing, that would
Yes, ma'am.
that would be
Be happy
fine.
to.
Thank you. And then you could answer the first question about running off a 1967 certification.
Right. I don't know the answer to your question. We have not completed that audit work yet. We can include it as a point that we will cover, and we'd be happy to report to you and the rest of Congress and the Secretary.
Does it seem reasonable to think that you should have a new certification or some updates since 1967, except updates to the user manual? That's fine. I'll look for that in writing. I want to go on to enforcement versus compliance at the FAA. So some have argued that in recent years, the FAA's safety philosophy has moved from one of enforcement to one of compliance, where instead of penalizing safety violations without penalty, the agency has instead given industry the opportunity to correct the safety violations without penalty in order to comply with FAA regulations. So, Mr. Elwell, would you say that this is an accurate characterization of the FAA's current approach?
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Compliance is the end game. Enforcement is a tool. And when we have a stakeholder in the system that is unwilling or unable to comply with our regulations, enforcement is aggressively.
So would you say that this is the current approach, enforcement versus compliant, yes or no, do you think?
Senator Rosen, what I'm saying is that compliance is the end game, and that's why it's called a compliance program, because we have enforcement as a tool, but we also work with people to fix their problems, because it's much, we found in our years of safety regulation, that it is a much more productive model. And this is not something that we just changed a couple years ago. This is an organic development of our safety philosophy over decades, that when you work with somebody who has made an honest mistake get them to compliance.
We're going to say that's a no, so you're working on compliance. So if that's not the case, and the FAA's robustly enforcing safety regulations, what steps can we now take to ensure that rules are in place to prevent this from happening again? And if proactive enforcement is paramount, why did it take the first MAX 8 crash for the FAA even to begin the process of requiring Boeing to make software changes to prevent these deadly malfunctions?
Senator Rosen, the process by which we improve safety is an oversight process that it is constantly refined, ongoing. It involves compliance activities, and it involves enforcement. What we have with Lion Air in Ethiopia are two tragic accidents, the reasons for which we still don't know. You can be assured by the FAA and by me that when the results of these accidents come out, anything that we can change and make better, we will. That's what we do. That is the primary reason for our existence, is to improve safety. But we have to get all the data. We have to get all of the results from the accident investigation. We don't know the primary causes of these accidents. But when we do, you have my assurance that we will take the action necessary that they don't happen again.
Thank you. I have one last question about the software. You mentioned that it masks the problem for the pilots, so that the pilots feel like the plane is flying the way it should. It'd be like if I was driving my car and a wheel flew off, but my steering wheel still felt as if I had four wheels. So why would you have software that would mask a problem like this? Can you explain
Senator Rosen, thank you for asking that question, because if that's the impression I gave on what MCAS does, then I'm sorry, because that's not what it does. It doesn't mask a problem.
Well, you said it makes the plane feel like it's flying to the pilot like it should.
Well, see, what fly-by-wire technology does, and that's what the MAX is. You know, when planes were first designed and flown, the yoke was connected to cables and pulleys, and so you had direct interaction, physical interaction with the flight controls. Pilots had the feel, sort of like when you're driving a car, you turn the
You
wheel.
have a feel, so are the instruments telling you one thing and the feel's telling you another with the MCAS?
No, that's not quite how it works. What the MCAS does is it is a computer program that feeds information to the yoke so that the input the pilot makes to the yoke is proportional to what the flight controls do. It doesn't mask any problem. What it does is give the proper feel to a pilot because he doesn't have those cables and pulleys.
So he would feel as if the nose were going down, going up, whatever he should feel, he would feel the same.
He would feel it, and in fact, that is what happened, and that's what happens if any computer or any device, even the pitch trim motor, does something to the nose of the airplane, the pilot's going to feel it.
Will feel that in his yoke.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Senator Udall.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz and Ranking Member Sinema, for holding this important hearing. And I know you guys have been here for 2 hours, so I'll try to just get to the point here. I first requested an aviation hearing on aviation safety last April when in Albuquerque we lost a shining light, a woman by the name of Jennifer Reardon. She was flying home from Philadelphia on a Southwest Airlines flight when a fan blade caused an engine to fail. You guys are nodding, you understand this one. Shattered a window and partially pulled Mrs. Reardon out of the plane. This incident was shocking, but it was not the first time of this engine type failed. And I know that this is just a first of a series of conversations on how we can improve the oversight of the Federal Aviation Administration, including rethinking, if necessary, the airworthiness certification process. Another important issue we must discuss is the integrity of engines that are used. Many of us may not be aware, but yesterday a Southwest Airlines 727 MAX engine, a CFM LEAP 1B, had an emergency landing during a flight to the Southern California Logistics Airport. This is at least the third Southwest airline that has had an emergency airline caused by engine troubles, all stemming from the same manufacturer of engines. Mr. Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to add an article on these engine troubles from the Seattle Times to the record, and my first, with your consent.
Without objection.
Yeah. My first question will be to Mr. Scovel. As you've heard, a constituent of mine was killed last year in the Southwest Airline accident because of a CFM engine failure. You have initiated an audit of the safety practices. What is your timeline for completing this audit, and will you include this most recent engine failure in your inquiry?
Thank you, Senator. Your first question, our timeline, we anticipate completing our review of Southwest Airlines maintenance practices by the end of this summer. We're looking not only at maintenance practices, but we're looking at certain operational issues to include weight balance questions, and also a point that was brought to our attention about Southwest's acquisition of a certain number of used aircraft and the fact that they are flying in the United States, reportedly without proper documentation. We don't know. That's one of the things that we need to look into to complete our audit.
Yeah, and are you going to use the most recent engine failure in your inquiry?
We'll see what we can derive from that. The one last night, sir, off the 737?
Yeah, with all three of the ones I mentioned.
For the first several, we'll see what information is available to us regarding the most recent one. Yes, sir.
Chairman Sumwalt, in your testimony, you referenced the Southwest Airlines accident that took the life of Ms. Reardon. I know the initial investigative hearing was held in November, but I'm concerned about the impact that the government shutdown may have had on the investigation. As you can imagine, the Reardon family is anxious to receive the information from the investigation. Can you tell me when the final report will be ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. I was the board member on scene in Philadelphia. I'm very familiar with that tragic event. We In November, we pointed out in the investigative hearing that we had some modeling and some structural analysis to do. We have completed that. We're in the process now of drafting the final report. So the report will be completed later this year. I will say if we find any need for any urgent safety recommendations, we are postured to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. Mr. Scovel, one other question for you. As you know, Boeing is one of the largest, most powerful companies in the country and a major government contractor with deep and wide connections in Washington. This plane was key to Boeing's future financial success. The company was locked in an intense competition with Airbus. Reporting has indicated that the FAA faced vigorous lobbying to approve the design and features of this plane so it could get it to market as soon as possible. Political appointees were urging career staff to get the work done, and a huge portion of that safety review work was taken on by Boeing itself so that it was self-certifying its own safety. Given the size of Boeing and their political power, do you think the FAA is truly capable of regulating them in an independent way? And what changes need to be made in the relationship between this company and its regulator to ensure that the safety of the flying public remains the paramount interest, not the quarterly profits of this company?
Senator, FAA has authority, complete authority currently to exercise proper responsibility over aviation safety.
Are they too cozy? That's my pointed question right there with the industry.
I don't have information yet to directly answer your question. The point of the first part of our ongoing audits will be the certification process that FAA and Boeing employed to approve the 737 MAX. We hope to have some information that'll inform your decision-making on that when we complete our audits.
Well, it's good. It's really important in this age where we talk about captured regulators and things like that, that you weigh in on these kinds of issues about are they truly capable of doing their job. Thank you, and thank you for the courtesies, Mr. Chairman, for going over.
Thank you, Senator Udo. Mr. Elwell, there were a couple of factual issues that came up during the course of the hearing that we're going to follow up with written questions and ask you to clarify. One factual issue on which there was dispute, as you and I discussed, the New York Times and others have reported that on the earlier versions of the 737, when you pull back the yoke, that it disengaged the stabilization system, but that did not happen on the 737 MAX. Your testimony to me, if I understood correctly, was that was not correct, although I heard Chairman Sumwalt disagree on that point. So we're going to ask you in writing to clarify how the system operates. I think it's important to have a shared set, an agreed set of facts, and to understand. Likewise, when I asked you about the simulations that pilots did as part of the certification, I asked in particular if any of those simulations involved a faulty sensor producing faulty data and how to respond to it. My recollection is you were not certain as to the answer of that, so I'm going to ask you to go and verify and give us a clear answer to that. I want to read to you some portions of an article from Reuters from March 19th, 2019, that purports to describe what happened on the Lion Air crash. And Reuters reported, quote, "The pilots of a doomed Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX scrambled through a handbook to understand why the jet was lurching downwards in the final minutes before it hit the water, killing all 189 people on board. 3 people with knowledge of the cockpit voice reporter content said." The article goes on to describe, "The captain was at the controls of Lion Air flight JT-610 when the nearly new jet took off from Jakarta, and the first officer was handling the radio, according to a preliminary report issued in November. Just 2 minutes into the flight, the first officer reported a, quote, flight control problem to the air traffic control and said the pilots intended to maintain an altitude of 5,000 feet. The first officer did not specify the problem, but one source said airspeed was mentioned on the cockpit voice recording, and a second source said an indicator showed a problem on the captain's display, but not on the first officer's. The captain asked the first officer to check the quick reference handbook, which contains checklist for abnormal events, the first source said. For the next 9 minutes, the jet warned the pilot it was in a stall and pushed the nose down in response, the report showed. A stall is when the airflow over a plane's wing is too weak to generate lift and keep it flying. The captain fought to climb, but the computer, still incorrectly sensing a stall, continued to push the nose down using the plane's trim system. Normally, trim adjusts an aircraft's control surfaces to ensure it flies straight and level. They didn't seem to know the trim was moving down, the third source said. They thought only about airspeed and altitude. That was the only thing they talked about. Do you have any reason to doubt that account of what occurred in the final minutes of that flight?
Well, Senator, the information I have is that actually there has not been, and I would defer to Chairman Sumwalt on this, but
please chime in as well.
That the cockpit voice recorder is not available to. I certainly haven't seen a readout on it, and if I did, to Chairman Sumwalt's point earlier, I wouldn't be at the liberty to even talk about it. But I would, and this actually is linked to what you said earlier about the confusion about whether the 737 MAX, when you pull back, it stops. And I will admit to not having flown it and maybe not getting that right. But what certainly, and I will react to what you read, but I will qualify it by saying it is entirely possible that what was written is not accurate. But I will tell you, as I said numerous times in this hearing, pilots of large aircraft are trained from day one when the pitch of the aircraft is doing something you're not telling it to do. You do runaway pitch trim checklist. And in every plane I've ever flown, it's called a memory item. You're not fumbling through books. It's a time-critical procedure, and you go to that. You do it in the sim when you fly. It's a memory item. So some of what you read there, I can't tell you if that's accurate. I can't tell you if that's straight from the investigation of CBR. It disturbs me because it is not the way I was trained and what I would expect pilots to do in that situation.
Do you have any explanation for why something like this might have happened, if the report is accurate? Look, I'm not a pilot, but certainly the picture that is painted there of the pilot frantically looking through the checklist as the nose continues to adjust downward, and as the pilot is unable to correct that problem, that is not an image that instills comfort or confidence, and it does not suggest that the pilot is aware of how to correct for the system that is adjusting the nose downward. Do you have any explanation in terms of the training that pilots undergo, how that would come to be?
Mr. Chairman, it would be inappropriate for me to comment any further on, first, an article whose veracity I can't ascertain right now, no, I have no comment on other than, yes, it sounds like a terrible situation, but I have no way of knowing that account is accurate. So it would be inappropriate for me to comment on it.
But there's nothing in the pilot training that the FAA required about the MCAS system and how to correct for it. Is that accurate?
Senator, the MCAS is not something you fly. It's not something you would get in a simulator and fly the MCAS. So
I didn't say you'd fly the MCAS. I said there's nothing in the pilot training about the MCAS system adjusting the nose of the plane downward and how to compensate for that in the event of a malfunctioning sensor. Is that accurate, that the training does not include that?
Senator, I would actually say that it is accounted for in the training. And the accounting for that in the training is that MCAS, inappropriate input of the MCAS is runaway pitch trim. And runaway pitch trim is trained and trained and trained by every pilot who flies a large aircraft.
Chairman Sumwalt, do you have any additional points on this line of inquiry?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay. One final avenue of questions, Mr. Scovel. I want to draw your attention to a June 22nd, 2012 memorandum from your office titled FAA Transport Airplane Directorate, Seattle, Washington. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman.
Good. The 2012 memorandum specifically state that your office's investigation, quote, substantiated employee allegations that TAD, which is the FAA's Transport Airplane Directorate, and FAA headquarters managers have not always supported TAD employee efforts to hold Boeing accountable. And it further discusses TAD employee concerns that Boeing employees in the Boeing Certificate Office might have, quote, delivery of airplanes as part of their performance standards. The concerns described in that memo paint a troubling picture of agency capture. Do the concerns in the 2012 memo, do you still have those concerns? And do you see an ongoing pattern like that described in the 2012 memo?
Mr. Chairman, I'm confident they fully described my office's findings at the time in actually 2010, 2011, and early 2012, as we were doing the investigation work that led to that memorandum from the Office of Inspector General to FAA. I don't know in 2019 whether those conditions still prevail.
Well, this subcommittee will eagerly await your investigation and assessment of that question because it is a critical question for evaluating ongoing safety. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask a few questions pursuing that same avenue. Inspector General Scovel, I'm assuming that that issue of agency capture or improper influence will be part of the investigation you're doing in response to my request, correct?
Yes, it certainly will be, and I should add, we're always on the lookout for it. We've called it out in the past.
That's your job.
It is.
Well,
we've done it several times with individual FAA employees in their roles as inspectors at Southwest, at American most recently, in a report that we issued last summer, and in the 2012 report involving FAA employees at the FAA ODA Oversight facility in Seattle.
So you'll be looking for any calls or contacts from Boeing or airlines or anyone else that may have impacted the FAA decision-making.
It's part of the certification process, and that's what you and the Secretary both and others have requested, and that's the mail we're going to answer, sir.
Mr. Elwell, when we finished, we were talking about the decision to ground the airplanes, which you said was your own exclusively, correct? How did it happen then that it was announced by the President?
Senator Blumenthal, as I testified earlier, from the moment of the Ethiopian accident and I became first aware until I grounded the airplanes, I briefed and kept the Secretary and the President apprised of all of our actions, as I would always do on something this significant. And shortly after, and leading up to, and then shortly after making the decision to ground the aircraft, again briefed the Secretary and the President. And the President came to my attention was very shortly thereafter going to a already planned press event. And as is his prerogative as Commander-in-Chief, he talked about the briefing that I gave and what my intentions were. And it actually preceded the official announcement of the emergency order. So
you briefed
that was
him,
the timing.
You briefed him directly?
I briefed the President and the Secretary on my decision and the data and the actions that led up to it.
Had he contacted you or anyone else in the White House contacted you previous to that time?
I kept the White House or the President and the Secretary fully briefed and apprised of my actions leading up to the grounding.
So between the time of the second crash and the announcement of your decision, there were contacts between you and the White House?
I briefed the Secretary and the President on the developments and kept them apprised.
To you their views as to whether the plane should be grounded?
Well, sir, I briefed them on where I was going with my data collection and my thinking, and right up until I grounded the aircraft.
And let me repeat my question in case it wasn't clear.
Yes, sir.
Did they indicate to you, did they express to you their views on whether that plane should be grounded?
Well, Secretary Chow never gave me any told me to ground or anything like that. And consistent with long-standing executive branch practice over many administrations, I'm not going to go into details of conversations I have with the president.
Well, what's your claim of the reason to refuse to answer that question?
Well,
that executive privilege, or there is no executive privilege?
No, Senator. No, Senator. I'm just saying that consistent with a long-standing executive branch practice, many administrations, I'm not going to sit and get into details about my conversations with the president. It's a long-standing executive branch practice.
Really?
Yes, sir.
Well, are you telling me that you're not going to tell this committee what the president told you about grounding the aircraft before you made that decision?
Senator, I'm just simply saying that I'm not going to get into details about conversations I had with the president. It's a long-standing executive branch practice.
I'm not aware of that long-standing. Is that grounded in law? And if so, what law?
Well, sir, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not going to talk about conversations that I had with the president. Details of which
I can't force you to. I don't think we can order you because we don't have that authority as of right now, but I'm going to pursue that issue.
Sure.
Let me ask you, under the ODA, is there protection for whistleblowers if and when they come forward?
Sir, it's my understanding that there's protection for whistleblowers at all times, ODA or otherwise.
Well, let me rephrase it. Is there protection for whistleblowers at Boeing? In other words, the Boeing employees who have responsibility, they're hired, fired, potentially disciplined if they make decisions adverse to the company's interests.
Oh, Senator Blumenthal, that's an excellent question, and I'm not sitting here now knowing, I don't know Boeing's policies with regard to employee whistleblowers. There may, in fact, be in the agreement, the ODA agreement that we have with the manufacturer, a requirement for them to take on our whistleblower protections, but I will get back to you. I'm not sure sitting here.
I'd appreciate your getting back to me. You're not aware of any protection for whistleblowers as you sit here?
I'm not aware that there is or there aren't, but I will get back to you, sir.
Are you aware of any whistleblowers coming forward about the Boeing 737 MAX 8?
I'm not aware of whistleblower complaints, particularly to what was being discussed earlier about management pressure. Particularly, I've not gotten from FAA employees. In fact, one charge that was in one article, that it was claimed that that FAA employees in Seattle were being rated against production rates, and I did look into that to see if there was any evidence of that or any complaints in that area, and the answer was no.
Are you aware of any incentive bonuses or payments by Boeing for certification decisions?
You mean Boeing incentives to their employees?
Well, they're the ones who are employed in this certification program, the ODA, right?
Correct, and I'm not aware of that.
Okay. I just have a couple more questions. I really appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. You and I talked in a briefing that you were kind enough to provide some time ago, and you indicated in response to one of my questions about the government shutdown that it was not in any way responsible for the delays in the development of new software for the MCAS system, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you are saying that any reports of the impact of the government shutdown on any of the issues involved here is not true.
Well, Senator Blumenthal, I remember the question, and we actually got the question. The reason I was able to answer you is because we had that inquiry earlier, and we checked, and for the work that we had to do on the software update, we actually recalled the individuals. There was no delay in that, in the certification or the work on that. And because of our role of continuous operational safety, the shutdown did not impact our examination or participation in continual operational safety post-Lion Air.
And I think you explained to me that the reason was that those employees were deemed to be essential to safety.
Yes, sir.
And therefore essential employees.
Yes, sir.
Just a couple more questions. On the issue of training, and I appreciate the courage and strength of the families coming to Congress, and I'm struck by, I guess, the feeling I would have that the training here really could and should have been better for these pilots. And I know that the investigation will go into the technical issues, but as a passenger and a layman, my feeling was the training should have been better. Would you agree?
Senator Blumenthal, foreign accidents, as Chairman Sumwalt mentioned, bring with them investigative challenges. We are at the very earliest stage in Ethiopian accident. Our responsibility of continuous operational safety means that if anything comes out of these investigations that goes directly to training, we would know about it so that we could relay that information to the pilots and the system we oversee. Of course, we don't oversee and regulate the training in foreign practices, but we do audit the civil aviation authorities of countries that fly to the U.S. And I believe that this is an area that we will look into very, very carefully, because I believe we can use the FAA's credibility internationally. And despite what you might read in the press, I believe that the FAA still is the gold standard, still has the credibility around the world to make change. We fight for it all the time. Our goal is to raise the safety bar everywhere. And that's what I'm going to try to do for the rest of my time in government service.
Well, I'm hoping, and I'm going to take that answer as a yes, because I think very unequivocally the training should have been better, and I welcome steps to make sure it is better in the future. Thank you.
And let me follow up on Senator Blumenthal's questions, both about training and whistleblowers. When I ask you in particular about a March 12th article in the Dallas Morning News that was entitled, "Several Boeing 737 MAX 8 pilots in the U.S. complained about suspected safety flaw." And the article begins by saying, pilots repeatedly voiced safety concerns about the Boeing 737 MAX 8 fleet to federal authorities, with one captain calling the flight manual, quote, inadequate and almost criminally insufficient, several months before Sunday's Ethiopian air crash that killed 157 people. Are you familiar with these pilot complaints that are being referenced in the Dallas Morning News story?
Mr. Chairman, I am. That is a report, part of the group of 24 reports that I reviewed personally and that the FAA has reviewed. They are ASRS reports, otherwise known as NASA reports. They were the first foray in our efforts to have voluntary reporting. And the history is important on voluntary reporting with regard to ASRS reports. I wrote many of them in my time as a commercial airline pilot. And the reason that they were put in place is we wanted to see if pilots could make reports of mistakes that they've made in the field, out in the system, and be indemnified as long as it was an honest mistake. Could we gather enough data and information to make safety enhancements and make the system better? It's been one of the most successful programs that we've issued. Now, when I did them, I hand wrote them. They weren't Flintstone, but I hand wrote them. Now they're computer entered. And we looked at every one of those reports. Now, I don't know if the one you just quoted went to an event review team, but when we find in these reports charges or problems that need to be addressed more robustly, that's what we have. We have an event review team. We bring the person who made the report in with airline officials, with FAA officials, and we sit down and we review the report. That particular report, as I said, there have been 57,000 flights since we introduced the MAX in the U.S. And that, to my knowledge, is the only report of its kind from a pilot about the inadequacy of the manuals. Like anything, we do a risk-based analysis. We look at the body of reports and the body of data. I will look into whether or not that individual and his complaint was addressed appropriately and get back to you.
Okay, I would very much appreciate that. I will say, as someone who flies myself every week on commercial airlines, and my family flies every week, and millions of Americans fly regularly on these planes, we need the flying public to have confidence about safety. And I'll also note, in the state of Texas, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs depend upon the aviation industry. And so that confidence is critically important. And I have to say, as a passenger, I would certainly find it troubling. This is, according to the Dallas Morning News, a captain. If the captain is describing the training manual as, quote, inadequate and almost criminally insufficient, that is a pretty serious charge. And so I would appreciate your getting back with the basis of that. Does that complaint that is referenced in those other complaints, does that trouble? I want to give Chairman Sumwalt and Mr. Scovel an opportunity to comment on that story and those allegations.
Chairman Cruz, in a former life, I was a consultant to the NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System, and one of the caveats that ASRS puts around their data is that they are unverified and that there are various reporting biases, known and unknown. They put these caveats on every ASRS request. If you were to request data, they would put those caveats there. And it would not surprise me if after the Lion Air crash, when pilots said, oh my goodness, I never knew about this MCAS system, and this really bothers me, and I'm going to fill out the report. So I think it's important to keep all of this in perspective. So that report in its own doesn't necessarily concern me. But what we do want to look at is to look at the training adequacy overall.
Mr. Scovel.
Thanks, and I appreciate the perspectives of both the administrator and the chairman. We will be looking, of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the hearing, into documentation, what was included in the manuals, and the decision-making that went into that, and beyond that, too, the actual training for pilots. I am aware of the ASRS entry that you mentioned. My staff and I were reviewing those the other week. So we're factoring it into our questions.
Are you able to shed any light on those complaints? And that one in particular certainly stands out.
I'm not, but it does go to the question of what did they know and when did they know it? So this is after the Lion Air incident. Some things were bubbling up within ASRS, as both my colleagues have testified. Was that factored into FAA's decision-making going forward? We can consider all that fairly, I think.
Well, I want to thank each of you for being here, for testifying in very short notice. These issues are of grave concern to Americans across the country and to the Senate. So I appreciate your testimony. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks, and during that time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record, and upon receipt, each of the witnesses are requested to submit your written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.